A lot of watch movements come with a unique party trick. And the most famous of all these party tricks is the auto relay feature on the Seiko kinetic perpetual movement. For those of you who don't know what the auto relay feature is, it's really simple. The watch goes into a sleep mode where it's keeping time, but the hands don't move. And it can stay in this sleep mode for up to 4 years. So this watch is in sleep mode. I know it's in sleep mode because it's keeping the date. The date wheel will move. And if you shake it, you would realize the watch hands move to catch up with the present time. Now the spring drive does not have any fancy tricks like that. The spring drive is after all just a mechanical movement, and it is a very fine movement though. So if I even tip this slightly, you would realize the wheel will, the second hand starts moving. Now why does the second hand move so easily on a spring drive compared to, say, a regular automatic? Like I've got an Omega. Let me move this around, and you'd realize nothing's happening to my seconds hand at the 6 o'clock mark. So even if I shake this, absolutely nothing happens to my seconds hand. But the Grand Seiko spring drive movement does start moving even with the most gentle rocking that it is subject to. So what gives? Well, it has to do with the mechanism of how a spring drive works. To understand a spring drive, we have to first understand how a regular mechanical watch works. So in a regular mechanical watch, we're looking at my Orient star movement. This is a really high quality movement. You have a rotor, or you can wind the crown. As you wind the crown, you are essentially winding a spring, just as you do with a clockwork toy. That spring transfers its energy to the seconds hands and the other hands of the movement of the watch through something called an escapement, which is what you see going back and forth. That escapement is basically two hammers, and that's what gives you the click, 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 click of a mechanical watch. Because that escapement is going back and forth maybe 8 times a second, 5 times a second, whatever number of times a second that it goes back and forth. So for example, high beat Seiko movements, the escapement is going back about 35,000 beats per hour. So you can figure out how many times per second it's going back and forth. Similarly, in my Omega, this is a bumper from the early 50s. That's the escapement. So that's my bumper movement out here. So that's my rotor, and the escapement right now is stationary in this. It's the gear train with the teeth sticking out. Just as you see the escapement on the I think that gets them in the right orientation, yeah. So you wind. As you wind it, you're basically tightening a spring, that's the mainspring, and the mainspring then kicks back and forth the escapement about a certain number of times per second, and each of that times per second is each time it goes back and forth, your second hand moves a certain distance. So for example, if you look at the seconds hand here, you can figure out how it's going forward in these small intervals. And those small intervals is the back and forth of each movement of the escapement. Of course, a quartz watch does not have that, because in a quartz watch, this is now really low on battery. The quartz crystal is timing the movement of the second hand. So let's get this aside, that Omega really needs its own video, as does the Orient Star, the spectacular watch. So what gives with a spring drive? Well, the thing with the spring drive is it really doesn't have an escapement. So even if you give the slightest winding to the mainspring, the second hand will start moving, because that's how finely sprung a spring drive movement is. Even the gentlest movement moves the rotor, because the spring drive has a regular rotor just like an automatic. And that movement of the rotor winds a spring in the watch. The same spring, the mainspring that you have there, you have the same mainspring. But herein comes the party trick. So the spring drive is regulated, because it's not a mechanical watch in that sense. You don't hear a click, click, click. It doesn't have an escapement. Instead of the escapement, a spring drive essentially has the same regulation technology as a quartz watch. The spring drive has a very small and a very sophisticated quartz crystal in it that I think they let it grow for 3 months or something, which then uses the electromagnetic force created by this rotor to regulate the movement of the hands based on the frequency of the quartz crystal. Now everybody knows what the frequency of a quartz crystal is. It's basically 2 to the power 16. So that's why it moves once a second. So the party trick of the spring drive is, if it doesn't have a lot of power, it's essentially unwinding whatever tension you've put in the mainspring, and that tension is not regulated. So right now there's very little tension in the spring drive. So as a result, that tension is very slowly unwinding the watch. So if you realize, the second hand on the Orient watch is just going to go ahead of the spring drive movement. But now if I very quickly give it a lot of power, so if I wind the spring drives, what's going to happen is the extra tension in this mainspring will make the second hand move very quickly till the quartz crystal gets enough electricity to kick into action, and then it will regulate it. So it really is a very fascinating study, and let's wait for this thing to slow down a little bit. So again, you give it a wind just like you give the wind on an automatic watch, but moment the mainspring is able to start generating electricity, just as the kinetic watch generates electricity from the movement of the rotor, because remember, every kinetic watch has a rotor at the back. It then uses that electricity generated to run a quartz crystal, which then turns around and regulates the movement of the second hands. So it's just very fascinating. So let's get so we're just going to we have to do this very quickly. So I'm going to wait for these second hands to catch up so that you can see how quickly the second hands of the spring drive will move forward. And the Orient is about to catch up, and let's go. And it's kind of hard to see, maybe the watch has to be fully discharged for it to show. But what happened for a second is the second hand started moving very quickly, and then the spring drive managed to slow it down, and then the watch starts regulating itself. Anyway, I'm not sure if that video was a success, but I hope the video was informative for you. Thank you for watching the video, and be sure to like and subscribe, and I will see you on another video.